I would like to welcome you all to SCMA Conversations. My name is Lauren Shea Warner, and I am the Membership Engagement and Stewardship Coordinator. Today's program features Yael Rice, the Assistant Professor of Art and History of Art of Asian Languages and Civilizations at Amherst College, and Yao Wu, the Jane Chace Carroll Curator of Asian Art. Next slide, please. Before I hand this over to our panelists, a few housekeeping items. We encourage you to type in the Q&A box throughout the presentation or in the Facebook Live post. Yael and Yao will be following along and look forward to answering any questions you may have. I will now turn it over to Yao.
Okay, there we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's SCMA Conversations. This is the third episode in the series, and I'm very glad to be in a conversation with Professor Yael Rice today. Yael Rice is Assistant Professor of Art and the History of Art and of Asian Languages and Civilizations at Amherst College. She specializes in South Asian and Islamic art, architecture, and visual culture, with a particular focus on manuscripts and other portable arts of the 15th through 18th centuries. She researches and teaches about artistic and architectural practices of the Mughal Empire, book arts of the Islamic world, global exchange and encounters during the early modern period. She's also interested in the utilization of computational methods and digital tools in art history. Yael has very deep ties to the Five College community, having received her master's degree from UMass Amherst in 2004 and a Five College Mellon postdoctoral fellowship in Islamic art in 2012 to 2013. Before taking up the professorship at Amherst, Yael served as assistant curator of Indian and Himalayan art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art between 2009 and 12. With that, I'm just welcoming Yael to join this conversation. Very glad to have you here with me in this conversation. You are the true expert on the two paintings that we'll be discussing today.
Thanks, Yao. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the introduction as well.
Yeah, so here on the screen are the two paintings that we will be talking about today. One is a rather contemporary work by a Pakistani-born artist, Nusra Latif Qureshi. The title of the work is Tropic of Capricorn, and another work is of a much earlier date from the early 19th century by an unknown artist, Indian artist, Equestrian Portrait. It's an equestrian portrait. And both of these two works are in fact currently on view at the museum as part of our centennial exhibition at SCMA Then Now Next. And I'm showing you an installation shot of these two paintings currently in the gallery. And this installation shot gives you also a sense of the scale of the two works. They're much smaller compared to another painting, a 1958 painting by another Indian artist, Three Queens, which is an oil painting. And these two works are works on paper. They are 16 by 10 and 12 by 10 inches, respectively. One of the goals of SCMA Then Now Next, this centennial exhibition, is to create pairings and groupings across the museum's collection to draw out their connections, right, in new contexts. But before we delve into the paintings themselves, one thing that I will call out is that currently on view at the museum, we see these two paintings beautifully matted and framed and hung up on the wall. But in fact, for traditional Indian paintings, the 19th century portrait, for example, that was not their intended ways of viewing. So I would like to ask Yael maybe to first speak a little bit about the original method of viewing paintings like this.
It's a great question. And it's true when we look at historical works, like the example on the far left that we see in the photograph. We're very accustomed to seeing them in frames, right? This is, what we expect to see in museums and in galleries, and of course, hanging on the wall. Now, I won't say that they were never ever displayed like that, but that was not necessarily the typical context in which they were viewed and shared and consumed. And more typically, they would be viewed in one's own hands, right? They are made, in fact, to scale, to be passed around. They're meant really to be kind of, viewed from arm's length, but also, accessible enough that you can pull them closer to take in all of the details. So, that's something that we have to bear in mind when we see them today in your kind of contemporary museum context, that we're getting a really different kind of framing, literally and otherwise, of these works that really would have been handheld. And of course, some of these works, I won't say that's the case for our equestrian portrait on the right, but some of them were, of course, made for manuscript or handmade book contexts. And that would speak as well to, their kind of handheld, functionality.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Yael. And I think, this speaks really to the afterlife of an artwork after it was made. And in the case of these two paintings, in fact, they both demonstrate very interesting episodes in the history of SCMA aspect of collecting and exhibiting Indian art in particular. So the 19th century equestrian portrait, for example, was a gift of Mr. and Mrs. John Kenneth Galbraith. And Catherine Atwater Galbraith, class of 1934, was married to John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a longtime professor of economics at Harvard University. And under the John F. Kennedy administration, Mr. Galbraith served as the US ambassador to India in 1961 to 1963. The Galbraiths, the couple, they studied and collected Indian paintings during and after their time in India. And between 1981 and 2007, they donated over 40 paintings made in historical India between the 17th and 19th centuries. So in fact, as early as the 1980s, in 1981 and 1987, the SCMA organized two exhibitions that featured their gifts. So these are archival images that give you a good sense of those two exhibitions from the 80s. And it's also interesting to notice how museum practice has evolved over the past few decades, right? We used to have carpet and furniture and even some flower arrangements in galleries that you don't see today anymore. And I will just quickly also point out that at the time of the exhibitions in the 1980s, in exhibition titles and in exhibition publicity language, terms such as Indian paintings or Indian miniatures were used. And the term miniature is something that Yael and I will come back to at the end of this talk as well. Just flag that for the moment. And then the 2002 piece by Qureshi was in fact also included in an exhibition that was held at SCMA. The way I remember them, paintings by Nusra Latif Qureshi. This exhibition was in fact this Pakistani-born artist's first retrospective in North America. She lives and works in Melbourne, Australia. And in 2004, SCMA really became the first North American venue for her to have a solo exhibition. 3 paintings by her were subsequently purchased and added to our museum collection. And Tropic of Capricorn, one of the paintings today, was among the 3. And I apologize for this very blurry image. That's really scanned from old slides. But coincidentally, in fact, Yael Rice, when she was a master student at UMass, worked on this very project, right? So Yael, do you want to share some of your memories of working on this project, and maybe how that experience has kind of paved way for your later development as an art historian?
Yeah, it was a really kind of unique, rare opportunity for me. I don't know if I had talked about this with you earlier, Yao, but I was actually an intern in the education department at the SCMA that whole year. So I'd been kind of sitting in the museum doing other things, of course. I had taken a course with a postdoctoral fellow who was then at Smith College named Anna Sloan. And that's how I became acquainted with her. And she is the person who curated this exhibition. And she very generously invited me to play a small part in that. And that was really exciting for me. I ended up actually writing a few of the labels. I wrote a little bit of the text for the catalog that was published. And for me, it was very eye-opening. As I had been interested in historical painting from India. I had not actually yet chose that as my career path, in fact. I thought I would do architectural history, and that's in fact what I ended up going to my PhD program to do, although I very shortly after that kind of shifted course towards manuscript painting. So for me, this was really fresh material. And then furthermore, getting to work on an exhibition of works by a contemporary artist. So I never really thought that I would make those connections. I remember actually one of the works that I got to write about and research, actually a couple of them came from the Mead Art Museum at Amherst College. So I sort of look at those objects as old friends. I knew them from way back. But it was a really, really interesting and unique opportunity. And I think in maybe some kind of subconscious, subliminal way, I was persuaded to, work on these materials, even if I didn't then know that that would be the path that I would choose. And in fact, I'm publishing a work by Nusra Latif Qureshi in my forthcoming book, a work that was actually included in this exhibition. So I guess it has a kind of lasting reverberations in my mind.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I didn't know that, you were a former colleague. And, I really like this expression of old friends, right? This is actually something that, we use for this centennial exhibition, SCMA, the Now Next as well. There are artworks that we just come back to again and again and again. But of course, with different exhibitions, different viewing contexts are created for them. Sometimes, a solo exhibition brings out a certain aspect of an artist's work, but when it's next to some historical sort of works, then different aspects get teased out, and that's very fascinating, right? Yeah, so now let's first look at the 19th century equestrian portrait, which exemplifies a type that serves as contemporary artist Qureshi's prototype. Yael, I wonder if you could speak about imagery like this as figurative types, and also the significance of horses and depiction of horses and their riders, and also maybe some of the common pictorial tropes, such as the turban worn by the ruler, the attendants, of more diminished scale flanking him, and then as well as some of the ornaments for both people and the animal in this image.
So this is a great painting. It really exemplifies the kinds of codified portraits that by the 19th century had become fairly regularized, especially in elite royal circles. So to my eyes, as someone who's looked at a lot of manuscript and other kind of related painting from South Asia, I can immediately identify this as a work from or around Jodhpur. And that has to do not only with the style of painting, but these very distinctive kind of large turbans that the figures wear. In other ways, though, it draws upon a convention of iconography that centered upon, one, portraits of rulers. And of course, we can easily identify the ruler, as you noted, Yao, that he's hierarchically larger. I mean, he's about 2 or 3 times the size of the attendants who accompany him. And of course, that's all by design. But also the figure of the horse. As we're going to see shortly, we won't quite get there yet. But horses were, highly, highly valued, not only for their kind of utility on the battlefield for transportation, but even just as sort of rare luxury commodities. Oftentimes horses were imported from the Middle East, from Arabia. And these animals, not unlike elephants that were also kept by elites, by rulers, were given names. They were portrayed in portraits. So we should really see this image not only as a portrait of the ruler, of, the man, but equally as a portrait of the horse that he rides upon. We get all the trappings of royalty from, the grand kind of saffron dyed turban that would have, been wrapped. Imagine the length of fabric to actually form that turban, to the turban ornament that we see, and we'll actually see more turban ornaments shortly. The jewelry that adorns him, from the pearls in his earrings to the emeralds that hang from his neck, his kind of muslin costume that the painter has been very careful to depict as, partially kind of translucent. And this is again to kind of suggest the fineness of these cotton textiles, that they were woven so finely that you can literally kind of see through them. But the horse is also dressed up too. Its mane has been tied with ribbons. I believe the orange around its hoofs is probably henna. That would have been used to decorate the horses. And of course, it's got a nice saddle. It's also wearing like additional ornamentation around the rest of its body. And of course, paling in comparison are the attendants, who are comparatively to both the ruler and the horse, much, much more simply, humbly dressed. And if you're wondering, by the way, the smaller figure standing just in the center of the composition in the lower register, he's holding a hookah, right? A water pipe. So not only is this ruler apparently, at least as portrayed here, sitting on, what probably would have been his favorite horse, but he's also enjoying a favorite kind of elite royal pastime, which is, smoking from the water pipe.
Great. Yeah. Speaking of imagery of horses and their riders, there is another great example, which really features the horse, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This I took from the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, because it is also an old friend of mine. But it's typical of any number of really fantastic paintings, portraits of horses that survive. We believe we know the artist who executed this work, and like our Jodhpur painting, it's also from the same part of India, in Western India, in the state that is today called Rajasthan. But this is not just any horse. It's not, a platonic horse. It's not a generic horse. It's in fact a very specific horse, and that's what makes it a portrait, right? We know the horse's name, and accompanying the horse, and this is also kind of typical for these conventional portraits, is the horse's groom. So if we don't have the royal or elite rider, oftentimes we would have the groom. And what really kind of amuses me about these works is, how much smaller the groom. Obviously, this is, amplified. The size of the horse is amplified, as is the groom sort of reduced in size. So he's not unimportant, but it's made clear that he is a lesser figure next to this horse. Notice also the really fantastic detail where the horse's rear hoof is actually kind of spilling out into this painted red border, as if the horse is getting ready to kind of, go into motion, like it's about to gallop away. So this is really to underscore the value that was placed on horses. They were named, they were portrayed, and to reveal that this is very much a convention. It's not necessarily invented. That is, this type, the iconography, this type of portrait, it's not necessarily invented in South Asia. There's a longer tradition of horse portraits, and in particular, horse and groom paintings that originate in Central Asia and today's Iran. And interestingly, they bear a connection with Ming China. This is a little bit of a digression, but there's a period of time in the first half of the 15th century where there's a lot of trade and sort of diplomatic exchanges between one Persian court, or actually a series of Persian courts, and the Ming court in China. And what's clear is that among the exchanges that were made were horses that were gifted from the Middle East to China, so traveling east. And what was then exchanged in return were paintings of horses and grooms. Yao, you might know more about this, but of course this was a standard kind of trope or iconographic type, of course, in sort of literati Chinese painting. So all kinds of interesting global connections. And it's really through a number of Muslim courts that are set up in South Asia during the 16th century that this iconography, this type of painting travels to India. By the 19th century, it's rife and commonly produced, and of course then appears by the second half of the 19th century in photographs.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, in addition to these two paintings of horses in this very exhibition at SCMA, the Now Next, we have quite a number of images of horses, either in paintings or in sculptures. And some of them come from East Asia, and some of them, from South or West Asia, and even, from Europe as well. And, horse as an animal really demonstrates the material and artistic exchange, right, that happened centuries or even over a millennium ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So right now, let's turn to the 2002 painting, which also features horses, but in a much more abstract way. And artists here, nevertheless, references and reorganizes many pictorial elements found in traditional painting. So Yael, I wonder if you could guide us through some of the direct or indirect quotations you have identified in the two registers, the upper and lower registers of this painting, and then maybe elaborate on ways in which she adopts and adapts these different quotations.
So great questions. So of course we're seeing the citation, right, of the horse portrait type, certainly in the upper register of Qureshi's painting. There are references that abound in this work. So I do want to just give a little tour through that, and then maybe we can turn to why she actually references these works and how she does that, and the kind of meaning and import of her kind of practice of citation, layering, and collaging. So to begin, right, we have the sort of horse portrait type in the upper register. If we go to the next slide, we can see actually not a direct translation or transfer, but really what she is citing in the lower register of her painting are Mughal equestrian portraits, of which there are many, many, many. I'm showing you just one example dating from the mid-17th century that lives in the Met Museum in New York City. And we can see, in fact, just from the profile of the figure, notice as well the profile of the turban. I'm talking about the figure that Qureshi paints. To my eye, immediately identify this as, sourcing a Mughal portrait. Why does she turn to Mughal portraits is one question I have. And I think it has to do with the fact that this dynasty, this Muslim dynasty that of course originates, at least in the early 16th century, from Central Asia, rules over South Asia for centuries. And it certainly by the year 1700 or so is one of the wealthiest, most powerful empires in the world. Mughal imagery repeatedly kind of figures, reappears, is erased, moves into focus, out of focus in Qureshi's paintings, because I think she identifies them as part of this longer genealogy of sort of power players, but also producers of powerful iconography. These types of sort of outlines, figments that, again, she sources, but also kind of obscures, right, as a means to reappropriate and even subvert their original meaning, because, the equestrian portrait of the Emperor Shah Jahan, this is the same Shah Jahan who built the Taj Mahal in Agra. This is a propagandistic image, right? It's not just a beautiful portrait of, it is beautiful, in fact. You could pore over it for hours. The detail, the execution is phenomenal. But it's not just a beautiful portrait of an emperor sitting on a piebald horse. It's an image of sheer power. And that's partly communicated, of course, by the posture of the emperor, the posture of the horse that he commands, the amazing sort of quantities of gems, pearls, textiles that cover the emperor, of course, the sword, and then, of course, the decoration on the horse. But I also want to draw your attention to this kind of halo that surrounds his head too, which Qureshi seems to quote in the upper register of her own painting, where it becomes this kind of floating, isolated orb, right, kind of drawn or pulled out of context. For the Mughals in their portraiture, where they depict the emperors with these golden halos, it wasn't just a kind of metaphor, it wasn't just to flatter the emperor. The emperors themselves styled themselves as quasi-divine. They even likened themselves to the sun and various kinds of celestial bodies, and among the names or descriptions that they used for themselves included plays on the word for light. So they very much see themselves as more than mortal, and these images are meant to advance that notion. And this is a good point also to remind you that paintings like the one we see on the right, and this was in fact made for a book. It was very likely housed in an album, which would have been a kind of collection of portraits and drawings and other kinds of works on paper. And these were made often to be gifted, often to be circulated, and the paintings that they contained, like this one, were copied in large numbers, really to be circulated widely. They were meant, again, to serve as the visual evidence of, quasi semi-divine kingship, but ultimately as propaganda. But in Qureshi's kind of take on these works, the fact that she sort of erases all the detail, erases the information that we would need to kind of place this figment, right, the figment of the equestrian figure in the lower register, in time and in place. She kind of turns these into what I've already called, figments or specters, in a way to kind of denude them of their original propagandistic function. They become sort of the traces of imperial rule. Again, the figments that haunt artists like Qureshi and others from South Asia who live with the lasting impact of not only, of course, imperial, but mainly colonial rule. Why don't we turn to the next slide? So in this case, I think she is very literally tracing, or close to it, this painting that we see on the right, which comes in fact from the same album or same kind of album collection that lives in the Met Museum in New York City. We see once again the Emperor Shah Jahan, the larger figure, and he's shown here with his son Darashikoh. It's not clear, I don't think you could see it from the image here, but or at least Shah Jahan is actually holding in his hands a dish that contains gems. And I believe he's holding a ruby in his right hand, in fact. And again, this wasn't just an expression of luxury or excessive consumption. It pointed to this idea that the Mughal emperors were connoisseurs, that they possessed this kind of rarefied knowledge, the capacity to sort of grade gems. They collected them, they assessed them, and so on. In Qureshi's citation, right, she's given a sort of partial representation of that platform on which Shah Jahan and his son sits. She's excluded the figure, she's excluded the bolster, she's excluded the footstool. So she's erased all of the glittery stuff that goes on top. And furthermore, she's erased some of the lines that you really need to kind of complete this form to make it into sort of a recognizable piece of furniture. And I think, again, here she's playing with the capacity of these types of forms and images to how do I want to put this? To prompt remembrance, right? She's meditating upon the very sort of fungible nature of memory, right? That memories are incomplete, that we fill them in, but they sort of lose focus. They lose the kind of specificity of the real world. They become sort of just lines on the page. Furthermore, another kind of interesting subversion or subverting act that Qureshi commits here is to remove much of, again, the sort of glittery surface. And maybe we'll talk about a little bit the process, the very kind of materials and techniques that artists like Qureshi and, of course, artists in the 17th century used to make these paintings. But the work on the right-hand side is encrusted with gold paint, with layers and layers of detail. Qureshi doesn't include all of that. I think she's inviting us to meditate on these forms, these images, without necessarily being entranced by the kind of aesthetic wonder of painting itself, right? She's kind of stripped all of that out, kind of extracted, right, the architecture, the kind of skeleton of the composition, and sort of placed it on the page in such a way that it seems to sort of it's almost kind of floating away, and of course layered over our figure of the Mughal emperor with his horse.
Yeah, except for the halo in the upper register, which is created with gold. That's suggestive of that material in the painting, right?
Right, but decontextualized here, right? This raises the question of the title of the painting, which we might come to. The relationship between the Tropic of Capricorn, right? This circle of latitude, and its relationship with the sun and viewing the sun. Of course, the sun here is no longer behind the emperor, right? It's been sort of repositioned and now kind of sits in maybe its appropriate position in the upper register. And of course,
the turban ornament. Yeah.
The turban ornament, which we see she has layered over the image of the horse in the upper register. We've already seen depictions of turbine ornaments, so now we're getting a sense of the real thing. I want to note, by the way, the dimensions. This is not a tiny object. It's about, I don't know, it's about 6.5 inches tall or so, and made of all kinds of precious gems. We're not seeing the reverse side, but it has absolutely fantastic enameling decoration on the reverse side. And this is an object that was made in Murshidabad in Eastern India, so connected to another court, not the Mughal court, but a closely related court there in Eastern India. And in her kind of characteristic way, Qureshi has again kind of extracted the sort of skeletal framework, the outline of this object, removed it from its context. It's no longer functioning as a decoration of a turban. It's no longer decorating a human being. It's now this kind of giant overlay, almost like the decorated saddles that we've seen in some of the horse portraits. But here again, kind of overlaid on top of the horse. And I think this is a really kind of clever play that she executes here, because the sarpesh, the turban ornament with all of its gold, the diamonds, the rubies, the sapphires, the emeralds, we're supposed to be entranced by this glittery object. We're supposed to be seduced by it. Qureshi resists that, right? She kind of denies that function of these courtly objects, these kinds of signs of power. She brings or distills them down to the outline alone, right? Again, suggestive of these kinds of traces, these figments, these specters, right? That kind of haunt and sort of float around in time. I also want to point out that she's given us no sense of any kind of historical trajectory here. Though I recognize the outlines in the figure in the lower register as related to Shah Jahan, who lives in the 17th century. It's hard to say when the turban ornament that she has depicted in traced fashion, when that dates from. So in that kind of way, she's also, I don't want to say distorting, but producing another sense of history, one where history is not linear, but it's layered. It's cyclical. It can be sort of mass produced, repeated, and so on.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I'm a little bit mindful of the time here. And I know that we've been primarily focused on iconography of Qureshi's painting so far. But I also know that her interest lies not only at the pictorial level, but also in aspects of techniques and materials employed in the Indian painting tradition. So I wonder if you could speak to the use of, say, paper, pigments, and also some pictorial sketches or templates that she inherits and revises in her work.
Great. So this is perfect to turn to this detail from a drawing that lives in the British Library in London, which shows us actually what is the underdrawing for paintings like what we have already been looking at. So this is really the kind of beginning stage of a Mughal painting. And part of the reason I also wanted to show you this or to share this is so that you can see the hard outline that Mughal artists and later Rajput artists actually employed in building up their compositions. Qureshi is emulating that. In fact, she's drawing upon her own training. So these hard outlines are very characteristic of a much longer tradition of manuscript painting production. So she, like Mughal and Rajput artists, also works on paper. She uses a very special particular type of paper that's known as basli paper. That is a word, it actually originates in Arabic, although it's used in Persian, in Urdu, and other languages. And it literally means something that's joined together. So wasli paper is basically layers of paper that have been glued together to create a sturdier, stronger foundation or support. And similar also to these to Mughal and Rajput artists, Qureshi is using mineral pigments. Okay, so opaque watercolor paints, so not acrylic, although actually I think she uses a little bit of acrylic in Tropic of Capricorn, but she's also using opaque watercolor. She's using sort of gold leaf, again, similar to earlier artists. And this is part of her training. I mean, she comes out of the National College of Art in Lahore, which famously, I don't know if this is still the case, but it was for a period of time the only place in the world where you could actually get a degree in South Asian miniature painting. And she's, you know, a graduate of this program. She graduates in the 1990s. So this is really the nature of her own training, her own practice, you know, working by hand, working with tracing, working with transferring images, making pigments and so on. But of course, in her own career, she has innovated this really kind of unique visual language that, you know, attempts to kind of, you know, make sense of this longer tradition.
Yeah, great. And with, you know, some time left, I want to encourage our audience to put your questions in the Q&A box, which, you know, we will get to just in a minute. But before I open it up, you know, for discussion, conversation with Yael, I want to ask you a question first, which is the question I kind of flagged at the beginning when I introduced those two exhibitions from the 1980s, which is the use of the term miniature. You know, that was very much the term back then, and still very much today, to describe this type of paintings from India and Iran. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how this term in the English language came about and what are its implications, and do we see it staying or kind of going away in academic discourse and also just maybe in daily parlance? And maybe paired with that, I see a related question in the Q&A section already. And this person asks, how much cross-cultural exchange is there with Europe in terms of the illustrated manuscript elements in the paintings? It's not, I think to some degree it's related. So could you speak to the term, but also the cultural and artistic exchange between South and West Asia and Europe?
Yeah. So maybe I can, I'll address the second question first, because that kind of leads into the first one. So there has long been, of course, exchange, contact between South Asia and Europe. This goes back millennia. In the context of the period that we're focusing on, say the 17th into the 19th century, well, obviously in the 19th century, indeed. In the 17th century, there's already a great sort of awareness at the Mughal court of European art. Not necessarily manuscript painting, but mainly prints. So engravings and such, as well as printed books. We have reason to believe it's very likely that European paintings also travel to the Mughal court, although very, very few of these actually survive. And this has a longer, there's a prehistory to this. This goes back, in fact, to the mid-16th century, where we have textual sources that indicate that the Mughal emperors were already collecting European prints. But by 1580, there's a Jesuit mission in residence at the Mughal court. And that kind of leads to a sort of, you know, interesting number of encounters, but also an uptick in the collection and possession of European works of art. And that's a really, really kind of interesting and complicated history. I'll just say that this leads to all kinds of experimentation on the part, not only of Mughal artists, but other artists across India. And it's a very kind of, you know, they have very sort of lively and interesting responses to European painting. European images. And not only do they kind of appropriate these images, not unlike the way that Qureshi does, but they also, redo them and kind of rethink them. So it's a good question, a complicated one, and it goes back centuries. So to the term miniature, there has been in recent years some push to kind of move away from that term, and I think mainly among academics. And the reasoning for this has to do with the fact that these works were never called miniatures by the individuals who made or collected them, okay, at least prior to the 19th century. They, of course, had different terms in Indic languages, in Persian, that were used. The term miniature, as applied to a painting, really comes out of the history of European manuscript painting. So the word miniature comes from the word minium, which is Latin for red lead, and actually referred to the materials that were used to make European medieval manuscript paintings. So how did people start calling Indian, South Asian paintings miniature? It really emerges out of Europeans and North Americans who started to collect these works at the end of the 19th century and started to write about them. And to their mind, to their eyes, these were miniatures in the way that, they were akin to European medieval manuscript paintings. Now, the resistance or some of the critique of the continued usage of that term, again, has to do with the fact that it originates in a kind of European context. But secondly, that a lot of these works are not particularly miniature. The work we see on the right is nearly a foot tall, okay? And, it's not entirely atypical. They can be quite, small, diminutive, and very, very, very sort of small, at a much smaller scale, but that's not necessarily the case. So I tend to avoid the term. That said, a lot of South Asian artists still use it. So, I think we have to be careful about, banning terms. I think, these terms continue to have resonance for practicing artists, and of course, collectors and others, from and in South Asia today.
Yeah, and I believe, in fact, Nusra Qureshi herself uses the term very comfortably.
Absolutely.
As you said, she got a degree in miniature painting, and it's a tradition that she's proud of, and she's practicing on a daily basis as well. But I think it's also very important to know the background story of the term and to understand its implications. Historical implications. Here I have a question, and I believe it's for the 19th century equestrian portrait, but maybe it's for both paintings as well. Is the color scheme symbolic or significant in any manner? So could you speak to, I guess, the palette? In fact, now we look at these two on the same, slide. There is a pretty much shared color scheme, a palette. So could you speak to the use of colors?
So it's definitely meaningful. The Jodhpur court and sort of related courts are in that part of Rajasthan. We're known, in fact, to use this almost kind of mossy green. So it's really, really easy to kind of pick out portraits, paintings from that part of India. What's more characteristic of Mughal paintings and some other related allied painting traditions is this kind of minty, cooler green that we see Qureshi using, and we've already seen actually in some of the Mughal paintings that we were looking at. I don't know if I have heard or read an interpretation of the use of this color that explains it all. So I will say, I think that it remains a kind of a question to be answered. But it does seem like the green is used often to denote not only an outdoor setting, but a very specifically earthly setting. But we do, in some cases, we'll see, little sprigs of grass in the lower register or flowers. So it does seem, that's kind of obvious because these figures are on horses, but we have many, many, many other portraits, because you would assume that horses would be outside. But we have many, many other portraits where, we have a single figure, again, in front of this kind of, characteristic mint green background. And again, my understanding of it is it's really supposed to be a kind of an outdoor scene, though obviously not, taken from, it's not supposed to be a sort of, landscape study.
Thank you. Yeah, and before we wrap up, just one last question, and very quickly, you mentioned that Qureshi was trained in the art school in Lahore, right? And so maybe the question is just about the legacy of this tradition in India and Pakistan, and maybe overseas globally as well. How, is miniature, in quote, miniature painting still alive today?
It absolutely is. I did want to actually just make one note that the National College of Art in Lahore was originally founded as a colonial craft school. In the 19th century. It's actually established in 1875, and the first director, it was then known as the Mayo School, and its first director was Lockwood Kipling, the father of Rudyard Kipling. So it's really, its foundations are very clearly, definitively colonial. It's reorganized and rechristened the National College of Art in 1958, so after India's and Pakistan's independence, just to kind of flesh out the longer history of that institution. So yes, these practices are very, very much alive today. There are a number of artists who came out of the National College of Art, not only for graduate degrees, but also bachelor's degrees. These include such artists as Shazia Sikandar, who just had a major retrospective exhibition at the Morgan Library in New York City. And that exhibition, by the way, will be mounted at RISD in November. So you can catch that if you didn't catch the show in New York City. But there are now many other places offering courses of various kind, not necessarily graduate degrees, but short courses. So one of them that comes to mind is the Prince's Foundation School of Traditional Arts in London, actually in East London, where you can actually take courses in miniature or manuscript painting from Iran, from India. And that's a really interesting institution. It was actually founded by the Prince of Wales. And it originally was, it was sort of based on an earlier institution whose mission really was to kind of promote the training and production of Islamic art. But even beyond that, I actually did a Google search recently just to see, where could you study manuscript painting? And there's so many more places and so many more individuals who are doing work like this. That I think it's more widely available today. And so for that reason, I would say it's a tradition that is very, very, very much alive.
That's great to hear. Yeah, that's so great. And thank you, Yael, so much for this conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot from you today, just around these two paintings, and just to have a moment of publicity. In fact, Yael and I are working together right now to plan for an exhibition that's dedicated to Indian and Iranian paintings, and hopefully will be staged at SCMA in the next 2 years or so. Really looking forward to further collaboration and learning about these paintings from you. Yes, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So now I'm gonna turn it back to my colleague, Lauren.
Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you Yael and Yael for this wonderful presentation. Next month, we will have a few virtual programs, including the SCMA pop-up shop online sale, which will be taking place on November 11th through the 14th, with a special member preview on November 10th. And our next SCMA Conversations, African Art, will take place on November 17th from 5 to 6 p.m. Finally, I wanted to thank our fabulous members and donors who make programs like this possible. If you are not a member or if you have questions about membership, please go to our website for more information. Thank you so much and have a great night.